elite. Let's now talk to the BBC's monitoring's Lebanese specialist, Hesham Shawish, who joins us now. And Hesham, good to talk to you. Give us a little bit of a taste of what exactly these protesters are angry about. Why are they demonstrating?
Sure. It's been another day of fast-moving developments, and protesters are furious. Not just the government response in the aftermath of last week's explosion, but also historic reasons. The high rates of unemployment and corruption and cronyism have just led to more and more issues. And then with the explosion last week, people have been furious with the response by the government and are blaming the government for the explosion themselves.
And now we've heard that the entire government is going to resign. How do you think the country moves forward now? What's the next step?
That's correct. I mean, up to now, 3 ministers have already resigned, and we're expecting Prime Minister Hassan Diab to deliver an address in about half an hour, where the rest of the cabinet is expected to resign. There are suggestions that a national unity government could be on the table, but that hasn't impressed local media stations and protesters. They're demanding a complete overhaul of the system and new faces in government, completely different from the faces that we've seen since the end of the Civil War.
And how realistic is that? I mean, these problems within the political class in Lebanon have been entrenched, haven't they? The different sectors of society, the different religions, they've been entrenched for decades. How is that change going to happen?
Absolutely. They're entrenched, like you say. There are a lot of vested interests and complex patronage networks. So it will be very, very difficult and unrealistic to see a change overnight. The announcement of the cabinet's resignation will only trigger early elections, but they're likely to take months to actually happen. And until then, the anger will remain on the streets. People will remain frustrated. Already today, we've seen so many people, so many volunteers on the street complaining that there's no army, there are no security forces that have come down to help with the clear up and the search for survivors. There are still people trapped in their homes. So there's all these volunteers that are ready to help out, but there's no one guiding them. So that's where a lot of the frustration is at the moment. On top of that, we're seeing pictures throughout the day of protesters trying to get as close as possible to Parliament, to storm Parliament, and to force the resignation of the cabinet. Pressure is mounting. We saw that yesterday and over the whole weekend, and the pressure will just increase until Prime Minister Hassan Diab announces the resignation.
And of course, it's important to give some context as well, to elaborate on the context that you've been giving in terms of Lebanon and the past 8 or so months. Protests have happened in that period, and people are angry, but more importantly, they are also suffering layer upon layer of disaster and economic crisis that have had a huge impact on everyday life, even before this devastating blast.
Indeed, there's a long list of problems. The economy has been in tatters since last year at least. Poverty and unemployment are soaring. The currency, the lira, has lost 80% of its value, so it's adding more pressure to people's pockets. Their spending capacity has been drastically reduced, and all this with COVID-19 happening as well, and the prolonged lockdown, which obviously brought about its own problems. The corruption, which has been endemic in Lebanon for decades, has really come to a head over the past year, and people are fed up. People are extremely fed up, and it's important to mention that on top of the economic problems, people have had to deal with the capital controls, the stringent capital controls that the banks have been imposing. So people aren't able to access their life savings. They can't spend as they need to. So it's just added to the woes that Lebanese are facing.
And just looking at these live pictures now of Beirut, central Beirut, outside the Parliament building, you can see, I mean, more or less, predominantly young people are at the protests. I mean, you've been monitoring, I'm sure, social media within Lebanon. What are people saying? What is it that they want right now?
They want the government to resign, and they're still calling for new faces away from the traditional parties that have ruled the country for the past 30 years or more. They want a complete change to the system. They want a strong state that will support them, that will back them, and they don't want leaders to be addressing their constituents on a sectarian basis. They want to be addressed on a nation's basis for a strong Lebanese state. So that's what they'll continue to demand for. But the difference in the protests that I've been observing over the past few days is that it's mainly comprised of young people from predominantly Beirut, where the explosion happened. I have seen young people come down from cities like Tripoli and some mountain villages, but it hasn't been in the same way that we saw last October, where the protests really saw support from all sectors of society, young and old, and from all religions. Over the months, over the year, we've seen a stagnation in the protest movement. The messages coming out from the protesters and activists have been mixed, and there's been this resistance to have a central leadership of the protest movement, which has allowed support for it to wane. On top of that, the COVID-19 fears, the outbreak, is obviously affecting the numbers of people on the street. We won't see as many older people or younger people participating in the protests as they're fearful for their health, which is another reason we're seeing fewer people on the streets than I would expect.
Okay, Hesham Shawish, BBC Monitoring's Lebanese specialist. It's been really interesting to talk to you. Thank you very much. We will, of course, come back to